Iran and the coronavirus, from government mismanagement to economic sanctions. Welcome to this virtual seminar from the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University in Miami, presented by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series in collaboration with the Mohsin and Fazia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow at the Stephen J. Green School, and want to welcome all of you for joining us here today. The coronavirus has been wreaking havoc around the world, but it has had an especially devastating impact in Iran. The reports coming out of Iran have been grim. Some 74,000 confirmed cases, some 48,000 recovered, and some 4,600 deaths. But the real numbers undoubtedly are much higher. After China, Iran became one of the epicenters of the virus. The reports coming out of there suggested widespread contagion, including to government officials and clerics. But the reporting of Iran like that from China is unreliable, and efforts to suppress information are extensive. How bad is the situation on the ground? There is, of course, another aspect to the situation, and that involves Us-Iranian relations. Tensions soared in January after U.S. forces killed General Soleimani, but worst case fears that that step would lead to a full-blown conflict have not materialized. Now, in the face of the pandemic, some have argued that it is time for the United States to lift the sanctions on Iran for humanitarian reasons to help stem the contagion. Others argue that the sanctions are not the problem. The problem is government mismanagement and prioritization on other things. The Trump administration seems intent, so far at least, to keep the sanctions in place. Is this the right thing to do or a missed opportunity? What is the latest state of play? Where might things go from here, and what should the United States do? To address these and other issues, we have a terrific panel with us today. Naisi Sardoui is instructor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU's Stephen J. Green School. Mohammed Hamayounavash is adjunct lecturer, Department of Politics and International Relations, also with the Green School. Eric Loeb is assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at the Green School. And last but not least is Richard Nephew, a professor at Columbia University and an expert on sanctions. Naisi, if I can, let me turn to you and ask you to get us started with some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to others on the panel. Thanks.
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everybody. All right, so Iran's conditions are pretty unique in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, obviously Iran is under sanctions following the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA. Iran then sees itself in an escalation with the United States, where obviously at the beginning of January, just around the same exact time that the Chinese announced that they have a problem in Wuhan, we have basically the assassination of General Soleimani of the Iranian Quds Force. And then of course, further escalation with the United States. And this is then, also happening almost in the midst of Iran's anniversary of the revolution. It's happening in the midst of floods that take place in Iran. It's happening also in the midst of the voting that's taking place for the parliamentary elections. So, I mean, all of this, and then of course the Iranian New Year. So all of this is happening almost simultaneously, from January to March. And of course the criticisms of the Iranian government, have been also been so covered in the West, to what degree were they suppressing? How early did they know? Iran announces the first deaths on February 19th. It announces 2 deaths, but then there was criticism that even before that there were some deaths that took place maybe a week earlier than this. Obviously, there were criticisms over the management, whether they had sufficient testing kits, whether they had sufficient protective gear for people in hospitals. The problem that Iran has, obviously, with closing, it's forcing basically more social isolation, given the fact that it is under severe economic hardship. All of these obviously are some of the things that you have mentioned. With regards to Iran and the United States, I think one of the approaches that the Iranian government has taken, whether it's Zarif or Rouhani or even the Supreme Leader Khamenei, has been to target basically America's soft power in Iran. Iranians are often very critical, when you hear them in conversations in social media, often very critical of their own government, often very suspect, obviously, of the management of the crisis from their own government. But at the same time, the fact that the United States has imposed Iran and actually hardened the sanctions in the midst of this is one way that the Iranian government and officials have targeted America's soft power in Iran. The other way that they did is not only basically to point to the immorality of the sanctions under a pandemic, but also to question America's own competency. So recently, Khamenei, in a very recent speech, basically also charged the fact that, you have people missing toilet paper, right, in the United States. So this obviously, I think these images of our own company are also something that Iranians are beginning to address also in social media. The other factor was the closing of the shrines in Iran, something very controversial. These shrines have not been closed. They were not closed. They hadn't been closed at all. There was a lot of criticism of people going into the shrines, with some pictures going viral of people licking basically areas of the shrine. And actually the religious authorities have also supported basically the government coming in and closing these shrines, and attacked people that actually came in and tried to attack the shrines to prevent the shrines from closing down. There's been a lot of criticism in the government of the fact that people didn't respect social distancing, especially a lot of people traveling during the holidays. And so there's been also a critique of people fleeing Tehran and going to other cities, with individuals taking it upon themselves to try to create roadblocks and preventing to other areas. And increasingly, there's also an interesting critique on China and the relationship with China. So you have individuals within the health ministry accusing the Chinese of not being open enough about, the extent of this virus, the uniqueness of this virus. And then you've had also others basically accusing these people of not supporting China in the midst of this pandemic, when the Chinese are also being attacked by the United States, and pointing out to everything that the Chinese government has provided to the Iranians. So, obviously you have a division in Iranian society between elements within society that are more, hopeful, or were at least hopeful to look towards the West and improvement of relations with the West and the United States. And obviously Iran becoming more and more reliant on the and supporting that relationship. So I'll close my remarks there.
Nicey, thanks so much for kicking us off. Mohammed, let me turn to you next if I can. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, and hi everyone. Good to see Eric, Nicey, and you, David, and nice to meet you, Richard. So Iran, to follow up on what Nicey mentioned, I think Iran has some certain advantages that could work actually in its favor. So it has a pretty robust public health infrastructure. I was checking their ranking in terms of the efficiency of their healthcare system. And in 2016, Bloomberg News ranked them at number 30, ahead of actually the United States and Brazil. They have established a pretty extensive primary healthcare network, and they've been working on this for decades now. Immunization is pretty accessible to both urban and rural populations. They have a relatively young demography, which is a huge advantage when you're dealing with the coronavirus. And also some 90% of Iranians have some form of health insurance. So based on those, I think factors taken together, Iran will weather the crisis with or without US sanctions relief. Yet I think the larger question that we should probably dwell a little bit longer here is that the United States, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, has essentially never let any crisis to go to waste in terms of bringing pressure to bear on Iran. And the coronavirus virus pandemic, I believe, is no exception. But the policy is counterproductive, and I think it's going to become even more counterproductive, because I believe that the coronavirus pandemic is going to move some tectonic plates on a macro level. And I think that's where we're going to see some opportunities for Iran and the United States to find and also to create common ground to work together. So the policy right now, I believe, is completely counterproductive for both Iran and the United States, and it's consistently delivering lose-lose outcomes. And I think, like I said, this might be an opportunity for the United States to think about formulating an America first Iran policy, something that I've been advocating for on all these talks that we've been having. Because the policy right now, the Trump administration's policy, is both heartless and mindless. In terms of heartlessness, I think Nicey talked, pretty eloquently about it. But in terms of mindlessness, I think at, all, domestic, regional, and international levels, this is a very bizarre policy. It's lunacy. I don't think it's policy, because domestically it creates anti-Americanism. And, sanctions, as Richard, knows better than anyone else, sanctions are not immune to the law of diminishing returns and economics, right? And I think US sanctions policy on Iran is at the vanishing point of its effectiveness. At some point, you're going to run out of stuff to sanction. So you have to double, triple sanctioning the same things that we've been doing. Regionally also, this policy of antagonizing Iran, sometimes gratuitously, has been creating instability. We've been fumbling around in pursuit of regime change policy in the Middle East for 2 decades now. In the process, we've spent, I don't know, $8 trillion with almost nothing to show for it. And in the process, we also deconstructed American soft power, not only in Iran, but also more, widely in the region, as Dr. Sardoui was mentioning. Also internationally, I mean, think about it. Who is the main beneficiary of this constant antagonizing and sanctioning Iran policy at the macro level? It's been the Chinese, right? I mean, this Belt and Road Initiative, this, I think the Chinese can turn the Belt and Road Initiative into their own Marshall Plan in the aftermath of the pandemic and the economic havoc that's, it's gonna be wreaking throughout the region and in the world. And the Chinese are already taking everyone to the cleaners. But let's say the IMF blocks Iran's, request for $5 billion. Then Chinese have options. Remember, the Chinese established recently the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which is headquartered in Beijing. So the Chinese might actually be the main beneficiary at the macro level, at the regional level of this Trump policy. And I think at some point, the United States will have to roll back and contain China. And to do that effectively and efficiently, we're gonna need Iran. Let's not forget that Iran right now, I think by default, is part of that Belt and Road Initiative. But the Iranians are not exactly exuberant about that project for a variety of reasons, some of which are geopolitical. And those geopolitical reasons actually line up pretty well with the interests of the United States. So I think there is opportunity for coordination, for collaboration, if the United States and when the United States decides that they want to operationalize that containment of China policy in earnest in Central Asia and the Caucasus. That's where I think Iran, in the Middle East and maybe in the Levant as well, I think that's where Iran and the United States could think on real macro geostrategic stuff rather than obsessing over, over little minutia and scoring cheap victories here and there. So, to just, to sum up what I'm trying to get across here is that I think Iran has accumulated over the past decade and a half a lot of geostrategic equity in the region. Iran has mastered the art of asymmetric warfare. It has mastered how to utilize non-state actors. And those are exactly the types of assets and capabilities that we're gonna need in countering, in containing, and rolling back China. So I think both conceptually and operationally, Iran and the United States should find, they need to find common ground for interest-based cooperation. And we've done this before, tactically and sporadically. This is not going to be unprecedented. We did this after, Afghanistan, after 9/11 attacks. We did this in a limited way in Iraq and even in Syria. But we have to remember that the Iranians understand geopolitics. They know how to play the long game. Their decision-making is not irrational, is not mercurial. They have a foreign minister who has a PhD in international relations. These are assets that we need to leverage and work to our advantage. But unfortunately, I think in both Tehran and Washington, there is this parochialism and obsession that is impeding cooperation on those matters. In both countries, I believe foreign policy formulation is contaminated by high dose of identity politics, unfortunately. And Washington in particular, I think we need to maybe initiate this. We need to depoliticize our Iran policy to the extent that is possible in Washington. I know we need to be realistic about this, but at some point, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the value proposition of playing this whack-a-mole with Iran by, for example, denying them medical assistance, blocking IMF aid requests. And as Richard has very eloquently mentioned in his book, sanctions need to be tethered to a larger grand strategy. Otherwise, they signal gratuitous animosity and hostility. And unfortunately, I think we're at that point. So I think a recalibration of that sanctions policy is in order.
Mohammed, thanks very much. A lot there to follow up on, but let's first turn to Eric for his thoughts. Thanks.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here with everyone. The main gist of my opening remarks is really to de-exceptionalize Iran. I mean, sure, as we said, it started in China and has become an epicenter of the Middle East and Iran. And yet you see common trends both in Iran as well as in the United States, as well as elsewhere in the so-called advanced and developed world in terms of how there was a response to coronavirus, both on the level of a public health response and crisis response, as well as in the economic realm as well. Now, I mean, one thing in terms of giving a little background about this is that, of course, this issue, just like in the United States, has become very politicized in Iran. As some of my colleagues mentioned, prior to the appearance of the coronavirus in Iran, there was already the government was already facing a lot of pressure. And of course, Richard is going to talk more about the exogenous or external pressures in the form of sanctions. But internally, you already had this crisis of legitimacy and credibility that state authorities were dealing with, both in terms of the way that they handled recent protests and the disproportionate repression that they used, even in the past. I mean, compared to past protests, the ones in late 2019, the repression that was used there, was on a higher level than it has in the past. And in terms of the effects that it has had on state-society relations in Iran, not to mention the way that the downed airliner was handled, the Ukrainian passenger jet, where there was an attempted cover-up for several days. And of course, this came within the context of the U.S. and Iran being on the brink of conflict. But nonetheless, the way that this has happened also antagonized the population and also eroded public trust in what authorities have to say and the information that's passed from the top down to the bottom. And of course, this plays out now, where for weeks, for days and for weeks, when the first cases of coronavirus were appearing and where people were beginning to become ill and even die in Qom, there was a cover-up for several days and weeks that have again eroded public confidence. But again, we see very much similar trends here, where the threat was not taken seriously, where valuable time was lost by state officials in terms of trying to flatten the curve on this, and where experts were pushed to the side. Because again, there were political considerations to take into account, economic considerations as well, and even as my colleague Nasi or Dr. Sadoui said, religious and ideological considerations in terms of keeping shrines open. Again, whether it was state officials that wanted to keep them open, or religious clerics, or again, those not being monolithic, or even people, as Dr. Sadoui said, trying to keep them open from the ground up. Valuable time was wasted in terms of not containing the virus in Qom and allowing it to spread not just in other provinces, but also even beyond into the region. in terms of creating patient zeros in places like Afghanistan and other Middle Eastern countries. You see some similarities, regardless of the fact that Iran is a middle-income country with a GDP of around $400 to $500 billion versus the U.S., which we're talking about an advanced developed country with a GDP of $20+ trillion. We're still seeing very much the same processes and outcomes play out in terms of a response that has been described as mismanaged, incompetent, deceitful, fragmented, opaque, and even coming very late, and leading to public uncertainty, misinformation, mistrust, confusion, and anxiety. And where, again, the advice of experts, but also certain parliamentarians and even members of the president's cabinet were left unheeded in terms of trying to implement lockdowns in places, in terms of trying to mobilize the media to distribute or disseminate accurate information to the public, to implement social distancing measures, and really trying to contain the spread of the virus to comb and to try to isolate it and deal with it there. And that was not done. And so it was really not, just like in the United States, even though cases were beginning to appear in late January and through February, it was not until mid-March that the government really started to take this seriously, very much like the United States government, in terms of actually implementing emergency efforts to, for example, open up wards in hospitals that were dedicated exclusively to the coronavirus, closing schools, universities, and certain businesses in different cities, and to implement really a concerted stay-at-home campaign and to try to implement social distancing and self-isolation in different parts of the country. Now, of course, just like here, and this gets to, again, Dr. Sargoui's point about how the shrine closures played out, there was different level of compliance among different citizens of the country, different segments of society, just like here, where some people took it seriously and others did not, and spread the virus to friends, relatives, associates, etc. And just like as our colleague Mohammed said, Dr. Hamouin Vash said, Iran is not lacking in advanced medical expertise. They have some of the best universities in the world in terms of producing doctors and healthcare professionals. They have a robust healthcare system. And yet, nonetheless, just like in the United States, these healthcare workers, doctors and nurses that are on the front lines, are undersupplied, and they are becoming sick. And there's been cases of these healthcare professionals dying in Iran. And so, these doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, just like in the United States, remain woefully undersupplied, as this is playing out. Now, in terms of the economic response as well, there were weeks of passivity, and there was weeks of, as we saw in the United States as well, of factionalism going on. And it really took a group of 50 Iranian economists to write an open letter to President Rouhani to say, look, we need to take action here. We need, just like the discussions were happening in the United States, we need a stimulus package to help low-income Iranians to distribute cash to them as efficiently as possible, and to help businesses, small businesses and other businesses that have already were enduring hardship prior to this due to internal economic mismanagement, but also to the sanctions, to try to help them and give them low interest loans, long-term loans, and also to prevent, as a way to mitigate unemployment, which is of course an increasing problem in Iran before the virus. It wasn't until mid-March where the president started speaking about, and the government started speaking about welfare packages and government assistance, the same day that they requested the IMF loan, in terms of creating programs for Iranians to alleviate, not just Iranian citizens, but businesses, as I said, to alleviate this economic hardship, and to create a stimulus package. Now, there's, the thing that makes Iran an exceptional case is that, unlike the United States, you're dealing with two executives in the country, right? So Rouhani requested permission from the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, to dip into the National Development Fund, which is a fund that's created out of oil revenues. They put oil revenues aside for a rainy day. And President Rouhani wanted authorization from the supreme leader, because legally he didn't have the authorization to do this, to dip into that fund, which I believe stands at several $100 billion. He wanted to take about $1 billion out of that, again, to transfer cash to low-income Iranians to help distribute loans for businesses, etc. And the supreme leader waited 11 days, actually, between mid-March to early April. It wasn't until April 6th, actually, just recently, that the supreme leader gave him permission to do that. And another thing, so, you know, of course, there was the economic response, and a lot of Iranians are saying that this is coming too little, too late. And just like in the United States, although, of course, you know, there's conflict over this between the governor and between different governors and the president in the US right now. But people in Iran have had no choice but to go back to work. So you see a lot of Iranians now going back to work because they can't afford to live, to pay rent, to feed their families at this point. And so, you know, again, economic priorities and necessities have to, you know, outweigh, you know, taking the risk to go back out on the streets at the bottom levels and also at the top levels. So, of course, you know, one of the reasons why there was a slowdown in terms of implementing nationwide measures, just like in the United States, is that there were concerns about how this would impact economies. So, you know, one of the major economic drivers of Qom is those pilgrimage revenues. So, you know, they were concerned about a reduction in those pilgrimage revenues, in other aspects of the economy, of course, how this would impact holiday shopping around Nowruz with different businesses. But also, as Dr. Sardoui said, the parliamentary elections on February 21st were vital to the conservative and the hardline camp of Iran in terms of trying to get people out to vote for parliamentary candidates, and the outcome went very much in favor of the conservative and hardline camp. And it wasn't just about that, empowering that group, but it was also about, you know, the Islamic Republic prides itself actually on having high turnout. It's a, you know, I mentioned legitimacy early on in my remarks, but it's a way that the regime or the state, it's what it uses to, one of the things that it uses, the levers that it uses to legitimate itself, in terms of saying, look, we have higher voter participation and turnout even in the United States and other countries. So, you know, that was a political incentive, you know, that superseded the public health measures that public health experts and even some politicians were asking for. A last point that I'll make, and I'll wrap these remarks up, is just like in the United States, you've also seen, as there's been gridlock among politicians, even factionalism among politicians in Iran, like in the United States, this has pushed or even compelled politicians to pursue military mobilization in terms of handling this. So just like in the United States, in Iran, you know, thousands of troops were deployed, both conventional military, you know, army troops, the Artesh, but also the IRGC, of course, and Basij, the paramilitaries of Iran, were deployed, you know, all around provinces, cities, and villages to try to contain this and to adopt different measures. Whether that meant producing, you know, PPE and ventilators and even hand sanitizer, or whether it meant even employing more draconian measures in terms of trying to, you know, as Dr. Sardoui said earlier, to try to limit mobilization or mobility and transportation among people, even doing door-to-door to try to find out who was infected and who was not. So, you know, we saw a similar thing here in the United States, but of course in Iran, it got a little bit more draconian. And of course, the IRGC, which was involved in the downing of the Ukrainian jet, has used this as well to try to bolster its legitimacy. So in sum, you know, we've seen a lot of similar processes and outcomes in Iran as in the United States and elsewhere. I would say that the 3 points that really you know, that differentiate Iran from the United States and other cases is, again, having two executives to have to coordinate this effort with, which makes it more challenging. Having issues with civil-military relations, because there's been times where the military has acted independently of civilian command, particularly at the level of the president, when you have the supreme leader being the commander-in-chief. And then the final thing, which I'll turn over to Richard to talk about, or Dr. Nephew to talk about more extensively, is Iran, unlike the United States, facing economic sanctions to make it more difficult to obtain the equipment and supplies that it needs to combat the virus. Thank you.
Great, Eric, thanks for the handoff. Over to Richard.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. I had 4 points that I wanted to make quite briefly, and then look forward to our discussion. The first is this issue of intentional humanitarian problems versus unintended consequences. I think one of the things the Trump administration has gone to some pains to explain is the degree to which the U.S. does not impose sanctions on humanitarian goods, and as a consequence, the reason why they don't need to do anything to modify their implementation now. While that may in fact be true as a legal and technical fact, it completely misses the point, which is that the actual presence of U.S. sanctions is having a potentially unintended but still very real set of consequences on Iran's ability to respond to the coronavirus. And why is that? Well, it's because sanctions are working as they're intended to work. They are making business activity with Iran very, very difficult. They're making it difficult to have banking activity, to have shipping activity, to have insurance for shipping activity, to be able to have any kind of communications between manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, and consumers. That is, in fact, the point of sanctions. The fact that those sanctions are intended to be focused on petrochemical plants, oil, nuclear goods, missile goods, and so forth is an important fact, but it's actually irrelevant to the situation Iran finds itself in today. Because the problem is that without having any legitimate trade with Iran to facilitate, there is no economic rationale for banks and businesses to maintain the types of ties needed for them to transition from selling petrochemical gear to be able to transfer humanitarian goods. You just simply don't have that infrastructure. You don't have banks with correspondent banking accounts, because if they have them, they're at risk of subject to U.S. sanctions for other reasons. You don't have shipping companies that are excited to Iran, because if they do, they run the risk of facilitating economic activity with the IRGC or with others, so on and so forth. And so the practical reality is that business interest in Iran simply doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in Europe. It doesn't exist in most parts of Asia. The only places you really see it are in India, China, and a few incorrigibles in countries that are usually prepared to work with the U.S. on sanctions. We also see that for those who are prepared to do business in Iran, their compliance costs are pretty high, because they have to engage in a lot of very aggressive due diligence processes to ensure that even if they're engaged in legitimate trade, they're not doing it with illegitimate actors, which is a whole nother dimension of the sanctions problem that also exists. Every time the U.S. adds a new person to the specially designated nationals and black persons list, some compliance officer at a big company needs to go and check and make sure they're not doing any business with those kinds of bad guys. And the result of that is that compliance costs are high. So you have a very fundamental problem here. The costs are high, the benefits are low. Why engage in business activity with Iran more generally? And especially that's made more difficult in a crisis, when you've got certain very reduced supplies of goods that you could sell to the United States or to Japan or to Italy or in any number of other countries without those compliance costs. Why on earth, if you're a business, would you ensure that you're able to sell those goods to Iran? And so a very simple reality is, even if we assume a certain basic level of humanitarian desire on the part of the Trump administration, that their sanctions aren't intended to have a humanitarian impact, they are. They are, because they are in fact stymie normal business activity, which is what they were intended to do. Which takes me to the second point. What should we do about that? Some people have said we need to suspend the sanctions altogether. The Trump administration has made very clear it wants to do nothing of the sort and just simply rely on the current exemptions to facilitate whatever trade can actually get through. There's, of course, the third option, which is to modify the implementation of the sanctions that exist. Some people who support getting humanitarian goods to Iran urgently would say that is not enough. They say that we need to suspend the sanctions so as to allow for normal business activity to reconnect with Iran. My concern actually is that that won't happen. That even if you suspended the sanctions, if you did so only for the duration of the crisis, rather than linked to any kind of durable political solution, you actually haven't solved the problem of those compliance officers and chief executives who are still going to be very worried about getting back into business with Iran, especially if it's only going to last 2 to 3 months. A much more practical and immediate sense of relief could be provided by modifying the implementation of existing sanctions. And I and others have proposed a number of specific steps I'd be happy to talk about, including authorizing comfort letters to give additional sanctions protection and a sense of comfort for those that may be prepared to do business inside of Iran, improving guidance, working with the IMF and others to deliver specific assistance, and working with the Europeans to operationalize the INSTEX arrangement, which they announced a couple of years ago to try and get humanitarian goods inside of Iran. And again, happy to talk about that at some length. The third point that I want to make is that this is important not just because of a humanitarian dimension, and that is a very real and immediate reason to do a sanctions modification, but because Iranians will remember what the United States chooses to do and doesn't choose to do at this point in time. And that will be meaningful not only if we're dealing with the current Iranian government, or even if we're dealing with the future Iranian government. Let's say the people who believe in regime change in Iran are right, and that regime change in Iran is just a couple of months away with keeping the maximum pressure campaign in place. Do those folks really truly believe that average Iranians are going to look favorably on the United States if in a time of great national crisis we held back from providing additional sanctions relief, even if it wouldn't prejudice our ability to apply pressure on the regime? I think not. And my biggest fear is that if the IRI is still in place, so the IRI goes away, the United States is sacrificing right now its ability to work with the future Iranian government, especially that young, demographically young population that was mentioned earlier that is going to have a very long memory of what the United States chose to do now and what we chose not to do. Which takes me to the last point. I think, unfortunately, what we've learned in this crisis is that the U.S. administration's policy is a regime change policy. There has been some speculation that that is in fact the case by looking at officials who've been around it, people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and others. I think this simply proves that that's in fact the policy. The fact that you are unwilling to relax, even to a small extent, sanctions pressure on Iran in furtherance of maximum pressure underscores that you believe that right now is your moment to try and topple the regime by fomenting as much crisis from underneath as you possibly can. I don't actually think that's a very likely event. I think that people underestimate the degree to which the regime is prepared to stay in power, the degree to which the population is unwilling to push it out of power right now. But taking that completely aside, I think the fact that our regime change policy has become so prominent underscores the degree to which we're going to have trouble getting international partners to support us in the sanctions program that we have. And if the Trump administration continues for another term, how it's going to be much more difficult to motivate people to agree with us to apply pressure to deal with the nuclear issue, with terrorism and regional issues, and so on and so forth. Because we'll have demonstrated that the only successful outcome that we pursue in this policy is a change in the regime. And that'll undermine our ability to engage in negotiations with this regime and to get partners to support us in trying to do so. I'll stop there.
Terrific. Richard, thanks so much. To all four of you, great presentations. Let me start with you, Nicey, if I can, and picking up on some of what Richard and others and you also were saying. How fragile is this regime? How much more fragile has it become based on its response and many would argue mismanagement of dealing with this crisis? Because the fragility of the regime obviously would have an impact on how the U.S. views the situation, as Richard was suggesting.
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. In my travels back to Iran, the several trips that I have taken before the Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA, when you would talk to people, you kind of got a sense that people certainly want a change. People certainly are critical of the government, a lot of the people, basically. But at the same time, it didn't seem like they my experience anyway, was that they were looking forward to the instability of a revolution. And I think the examples that have been set up with what has happened in Iraq, what has happened to Syria, have certainly been reminders, Libya, elsewhere, certainly have been reminders of what they can go through if there is this level of instability and the regime is gone. So, that's one sense that is, and aside from their criticisms, the examples around them don't bode well for a transformation and change of regime. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, and Eric alluded to this, was a question of that the regime obviously has these elections, parliamentary elections, presidential elections, and the high voter turnout is something that they pride themselves to give themselves legitimacy. We noticed that there was significant low voter turnout, and that's because there was a lot of disqualifying of candidates, but also because this is happening in the aftermath of the downing of the flight, right? That was down the same night that the United States did the strikes on the bases in Iraq. And of course, the government's silence on this 3 days, and people were certainly very angry. So all of this is, again, taking place in the same time. There's a lot of questioning about the transparency of the government. There's a lot of criticism of the government. At the same time, one of the things that really surprised me was the incredible turnout for Soleimani's funeral, right? I was not expecting that, especially a couple of weeks after this violent suppression of protesters that had gone out into the streets over the rise in the gasoline prices, right? So, it's very difficult to tell in a government, in a country like Iran. You have many, many factors. Certainly there's criticism of the government. Certainly there's widespread criticism. But again, I think also the attacks that the government has also placed on the competency of other governments, in managing this crisis, also makes some Iranians feel like, well, wait a minute, look at how many deaths are happening in a city like New York, where Iranians tend to look at outside states, especially a country like the United States and the West, as, so powerful and so, together and so efficient. And so for them to also see the kinds of things that we've experienced here, I think for them, it's something that the government is playing well, right? And I've heard reports on social media that people are saying, well, wait a minute, they didn't do that well either, right? So, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer. I hope that I've covered,
No, I appreciate that very much, sure. Mohammed, let me turn to you, and some who listen to what you had to say may argue, sure, we should work together because China poses arguably the biggest challenge we face in the world today. But Iran obviously is not operating with clean hands. The lead state sponsor of terrorism, what it's doing in Syria, propping up the Assad regime, working with Russia and others. So how do you balance that, and what impact might the pandemic have on Iran's ability to stir up trouble and launch these kinds of provocative actions?
Yeah. So I think, Secretary Kissinger has a famous saying that Iran has to stop acting like a cause and start operating like a country. And I think there is certain, level of truth to that statement. But I think the same could also be said about the United States when it comes to interacting with Iran. I mean, do we treat Iran as a nation state? Does Iran have certain regional interests, or do we just want them to roll over and play dead? And I think at some point we have to answer that question with some level of finality. So like Richard was mentioning, I think lurking behind the scenes always in Washington is this obsession with regime change. And I think unless and until we let go of that, we're not going to come to a rational Iran policy. And yes, Iran, has been provocative, but like any other nation state, I think they think that they have certain regional interests that need to be respected. And I think they believe in Tehran that they're being artificially suppressed by the United States and our regional allies. Because at some point, I think in the wake of this corona crisis, we will need to accelerate our retrenchment from the Middle East, just by virtue of the fact that we will have to take China more seriously. And then we're going to need Iran. If we lose Iran permanently to China, I think that's going to be a major geostrategic damage to our future containment of China policy. And that's where I see the most crucial pitfall with this obsession with regime change, that in the long term, it's going to hurt, more than help our interests in the region. And let's not forget that one of the consequences of the global response to the pandemic has been countries acting very unilaterally. You see unilateralism even within the context of the European Union. For example, the Germans refusing to sell, N95 masks to Italy, or the Czech Republic, stealing Italy's, ventilators midair. So we see these types of things happening, and so the institutional context of international relations, I think, has diluted substantially in the wake of the crisis. And a lot of countries, I think, are going to be acting more unilaterally. And the notion of soft power, I think, is going to be more in crisis, just atmospherically across the board. And that will obviously apply to the United States. So I think we need to act with rationality, with a kind of level-headed realism with Iran and with China. And I think if we adopted that less identity politics, more realism, more interest-based foreign policy in the region, we can find and we can generate commonality of interest with Iran at the macro level.
Eric, let me turn to you next and ask you a flip side of this kind of question, which is how realistic is it to change policy toward Iran, given the interests and equities of some of the regional players, say especially Saudi Arabia, to maintain a tough position, hard sanctions against Iran? And what impact can the current pandemic have on Iran's abilities to act beyond its borders?
Okay, well, thanks for those questions. Again, I mean, to get back, it's if there was a rational policy here, there would be a time for cooperation, regional coordination, because I was just reading today that the Saudis are now rushing to the Grand Mosque of Mecca now to try to manage the coronavirus there. So again, by exacerbating the situation in Iran, by limiting their ability to fight the coronavirus within their borders, even though we have a very some of our elites here in the United States have adopted this isolationist, nativist thinking that, because it's going on over there, it won't come to our borders. That was proven wrong. And of course, we had our own leadership here that started canceling flights when they knew that was a fallacy. It's the same process over there where, again, by hindering Iran's ability to fight this virus within its borders, as I said within my opening remarks, we're simultaneously hindering the ability of our so-called allies or other countries in the region to fight theirs as well, because no borders are completely sealed, and so as Iran became an epicenter, the virus was diffusing or emanating to other countries in the region, and yet of course, Mohammed talks about a rational policy, right? That we should be looking for win-win situations. And the problem is that these policies are ideological and have gained inertia over time. So rather than seeing things in the framework of win-win, they're very, very much seen in the framework of a zero-sum game, right? That the loss for Iran would be a gain for Saudi Arabia, would be a gain for other countries in the region. And yet, now's the time to recalibrate that thinking. I'm just skeptical, given the mindset of elites that were going, that have been in power, leading up to this virus, that there will be this inability. And yet, we're seeing countries start to soften. So, one of the theaters that hasn't come up yet is Yemen, where it seems that the Saudis are now realizing, and perhaps again, it's not just another crisis that we didn't just touch upon, but there's a twin crisis for a lot of these Gulf countries. It's number one, the coronavirus, which has sapped demand out of the oil industry, but number two, of course, the price war that was going on within the framework of OPEC plus between the Saudis, the Russians, even the United States, right, driving prices down when these countries were refusing to cut output, which they now have, and I'm not sure it will be enough. And I think that those resource constraints now that these countries like Saudi Arabia are dealing with have caused them to soften and to say, look, we are now open to talking to the Houthis in Yemen, which are seen as an extension of Iran, but of course they have agency of their own, and they're a local, very much a local actor in Yemen, of course getting Iranian support. Where, you know, now there's some reality checks happening, right? And there's a bit of softening. You know, we'll see how this plays out in Yemen, and we'll see how this plays out in the region, you know, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this so-called Cold War that's going on. And this will also impact Iran's proxies in the region, which, you know, was the second part of your question, because this network of proxies or non-state actors or partners, you know, which Mohammed talked about as being assets to Iran, in terms of Iran be able to create strategic depth and push back against its adversaries in the region and against U.S. interests in the region, is very much impacted, you know, not just by resource constraints, which Iran is facing now, but also geopolitical realities on the ground, right? So if this causes the Saudis to soften in Yemen, then you know, this will recalibrate perhaps Tehran's thinking as well in terms of how it operates in Yemen and even beyond in places like Syria and Iraq.
Great, thanks very much, Eric. Richard, let's assume someone from the administration was joining us in this chat, and that person would argue that our problem, our beef is not with the Iranian people, it's with the Iranian regime. And while we want the best for the Iranian people, we want to be helpful, it would be a foolish mistake for us to ease up on the pressure now as the pandemic heightens yet another shortcoming failing of this regime. How would you respond to that?
I would say, yeah, that may be in fact true, and that might be the right reason to keep the rest of the sanctions pressure on the regime. But it actually highlights that we have a responsibility and potentially even an opportunity to demonstrate that while the Iranian government is incapable or unwilling to provide support and assistance to the Iranian population, we can. Right? That we are in a position and we are prepared to modify our sanctions in order to facilitate humanitarian business with Iran. And I think that this, to me, is the most troublesome part of the administration's pushback. If they want to push back on suspension of sanctions altogether as being unnecessary and counterproductive, fine, fair enough. But a lot of what has been advocated thus far is not suspension of sanctions and relaxing, for instance, pressure on the IRGC or pressure on Iranian oil revenues, but rather making it easier for Iran to use some of the oil revenues they have stored up in China and South Korea and Japan solely for humanitarian goods and to get them inside of Iran, right? Or to provide some degree of comfort and safe passage and you know, a safe harbor for entities to be able to engage in humanitarian trade with Iran for the benefit of the Iranian population. And so I would say if you want to demonstrate that there is a better way other than the Islamic Republic's way of handling the population, the way you do that actually is by modifying the implementation of your sanctions to allow for humanitarian goods to get through. And even if you think it'll only have a marginal benefit, then at a minimum, you have a potential U.S. propaganda victory here. And I think this is the last point I would make. It's the failure of imagination and the failure of vision on the part of this administration that's so troubling at this point. They're persisting with this idea that we can have one conversation inside of the United States and it won't get back to the Iranian population, that they won't know that we are saying no to modification of sanctions in a way that doesn't sap pressure but would help the population, that the Iranian population won't hear about it, but they do. And they will hear and understand that at a moment of great crisis, the United States decided that we weren't going to do anything and that we were content with simple words on a page being sufficient as our humanitarian benefits. And I think that is a opportunity lost in addition to a humanitarian crisis exacerbated.
Thanks. This conversation has gone very quickly, but we're almost out of time. I do want to give each of you just 1 minute. Try to be disciplined, if you would. 1 minute to offer some final words, either a recommendation on policy, a message to the Iranian people, to the extent that they might be able to hear and see this. And Nicey, let's start with you, or a point that we didn't get a chance to make.
I think I just wanted to point back a little bit to this, something that I missed out talking about with regards to the voter turnout in the elections, that you did have high voter turnouts when Rouhani was elected during his 2 terms of office. And those people that were voting for him were people that were hoping for a change and hoping for an improvement in relations, to improve relations with the United States. And I think that the Trump administration's policies has basically been to undermine Rouhani and to undermine those individuals within Iran that would have preferred a policy change in the Iranian government. So that's one aspect of it. I think even before this coronavirus thing, even before the sanctions were imposed on Iran, don't forget that the Iranians were also banned from getting visas to come to the United States. So, that's also a message to the Iranians that, look, we're allowing all of these other states who are also have problematic connections with terrorist organizations. And of course, the 4 top organizations are what? Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, Taliban, none of which are, or Al-Qaeda, none of which are associated with the Iranians. And yet the Iranians were punished. And this is the Iranian people. So I think this is a message also to them, that we're not necessarily doing a very good job in distinguishing the Iranian people from the Iranian government. The other thing was also that, yes, in the past, Iran and the United States have cooperated significantly. It's not just about hostilities. There have been many opportunities, and they have shared similar enemies, whether it's been Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or Saddam Hussein or the Islamic State. So there's certainly opportunities to change the conversation that we have about Iran, and I think it's essential for us to do that.
With 60 seconds to you.
Is that for me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just 2 quick points. Like I said, I think the conventional wisdom in Washington about Iran has been neither conventional and, to be honest, not very wise. And I tend to a little bit disagree with Richard in trying to make such a stark contrast between the Obama and the Trump administration's Iran policy. I think that's, debatable, but I don't see such major, fault line in the attitude of both administrations towards Iran. I think it's more of a matter of degree than a qualitative difference. But I do believe that the Trump administration's, callous and I would say obstructive attitude towards, facilitating medical aid to hard-hit Iran and weaponizing COVID-19 essentially towards Iran, it's going to have long-term consequences in terms of belying future American administration's rhetoric of democratization and human rights. And I think we have to be cautious of those long-term impacts that this policy is going to have. So like I said, I think this is a golden opportunity to recalibrate, to repivot. But unfortunately, I'm an avid reader of history. History has shown me that countries are not particularly nimble, or for that matter, good learners. So I won't hold my breath on seeing any major changes there.
All right, Eric.
So, what perturbs me about the current situation is, not just that we're set in our policies. I think Richard eloquently discussed that, how it's not just that the administration is not willing to budge on this. It's that as the coronavirus is getting worse in the United States, in Iran, around the world, the United States, which is, the response has been controversial, has been lacking, where we have, people each and every day, getting sick, people dying. Again, healthcare workers on the front lines, not getting the supplies that they need. We have not just competition at the global level to get that supplies, but even domestically between FEMA, between the states. We are still in a dire situation here, right? And the fact that our federal leadership and elites in Washington, they have a lot of work to do, right, to say the least, is devoting time, energy, and resources to upping the ante right now against Iran. It's not that they're just holding firm, but they are increasing sanctions. They are actually taking the time to designate more officials, organizations, and individuals in Iran to sanction than to announce those sanctions. And they're not being bashful about it. That they're also, they took the time to craft a message, right, in the State Department, and then to issue that message to the American public and the international public. that that giving money to Iran would be a scam, right? Or that easing sanctions would be a scam on April 4th. That Iran already has enough funds at its disposal. That it would use the money for adventurism in the region and abroad. You know, so and then of course, which we've talked about, you know, throughout this conversation, the fact also that we're dedicating time and resources and energy to block the $5 billion request at the IMF, which coincided with Iran's attempts to get a stimulus package going inside the country. I mean, you know, that's what's really disconcerting here, that we, you know, we're trying to fight our own battle here in the United States, and that this is where our officials are spending their time and energy. You know, of course, you know, there's the humanitarian implications in Iran, but there's also humanitarian implications here. So, you know, I would encourage or even plead with our officials to spend their time and energy on alleviating the situation here in the United States.
Richard, last minute goes to you.
Great, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I just have 2 points. You know, first, I do think that there is a fundamental difference between how the Obama administration, and for that matter, the Bush administration, used sanctions against Iran and what the Trump administration is doing. And that's less in the means, because obviously what Trump has done is mostly use the sanctions that we came up with in the Bush and the Obama administrations that Congress came up with, and more in the ends. That both under Bush and Obama, there was a recognition that the Islamic Republic of Iran was the government of Iran, and that we were going to have to deal with it, to some extent more happily than in other places. And in fact, if folks recall, Barack Obama got himself in some hot water politically when he acknowledged that there is a regional role for Iran, that they are a fact that has to be dealt with. And I think that's where the Trump administration demonstrates its differences here. That they, as one Hill staffer once asked me a long time ago, actually believe that we're in a position to deny Iran a regional role, and that it can be denied from having regional power. And that's because they fundamentally believe that we can change the state inside of Iran. And I think that so long as those policy differences remain in the intended end, you're going to continue to see an unwillingness to negotiate seriously with the Iranians under this presidency. And you're certainly going to see an unwillingness to relax the pressure in any way, because to do so is to compromise this effort of regime change. And the last point I'll just say attached to that, and this goes back to an earlier point made, is that the real danger with a regime change policy, beyond the fact that it might not work, is that it might work. And I think as we've seen in the cases of Iraq, and we've seen the cases of a number of other different countries, the success rate of regime change actually turning out to be something that we enjoy, and something that's in furtherance of U.S. policy interests, let alone the interests of the country in question, is a dubious proposition at best. And so I think that as much as this administration is dedicated to the goal of regime change and to using sanctions as a means to that end, they ought to actually spend some time thinking about whether or not even the end is something that's in furtherance of our long-term interests in the Middle East and more generally.
We will have to leave it there. Let me thank Naisi Sardoui, Mohammed Hamayunbash, Eric Loeb, Richard Nephew. Terrific discussion. Thanks so much. It went very quickly, which is always a sign of a fascinating conversation. I want to thank all of you for joining us and watching this virtual seminar from the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University, presented by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series in collaboration with the Mohsin and Fazia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies. If you have any comments you want to send, please send them to sipa@fiu.edu. That's SIPA@fiu.edu. I'm David Kramer. Thanks very much for joining us.